Warm thanks, Dr. Aslan. Warm thanks also for the invitation. And I'm really glad to be joining you this morning online, though, not from Brussels, where I'm usually based, but from Czech Republic, where I am at present with a work-related visit, and address you indeed on this important topic for the association that I work for, which is a network of national level funding agencies for mobility and wider internationalization activities. And that has been also one of the red threads into my own work. So indeed, as you see on the slide, the title of the talk is Student Mobility and Recognition Post-Pandemic, Reality Check and a Vision. And I've structured my brief talk this morning into three main parts. I thought it would be helpful nonetheless under the reality check part to have a short reminder of where we were with student mobility related developments and recognition related efforts before the COVID pandemic started. Trying to take stock in a second part of the impact of the pandemic on mobility trends and recognition, and addressing towards the end of the talk some reflections on developments and expectations for the post-pandemic period, and trying to outline more of a personal vision or a wish on these further developments. So without further ado, a quick reminder on where we were with the student mobility flows in the pre-pandemic area. I'd like to start by making obviously a clear distinction between degree mobility on the one hand, so the mobility that is carried out by mobile students for completing a full degree abroad, and credit mobility on the other hand, or shorter term mobility that is usually conducted for a shorter part of a study program at a home institution. As those of you in the audience that are very familiar with the student mobility developments and data might know, we always have a bit of a delay on the data that is available on these flows at the international level, the comparative data. So in fact, the latest data that you see here on the slide is also the one that was recently published by the Wissenschaft Weltoffen publication of DAAD. The flows, though, stand for the year 2018, which is the latest for which we can have this comparative picture. We see, though, nonetheless, I think, looking at this comparative picture since the mid-70s up to 2018, a steady growth in the internationally mobile student numbers for full degrees. The figure standing in 2018 at 5.6 million students that were internationally mobile for the purpose of completing a full degree abroad. Some figures that were published by the OECD, I think a couple of weeks ago, lead us to a total figure for 2019 of 3 million students. We don't yet have the breakdown, though, outside the OECD countries, so hence this data today. So a steady growth, as I mentioned, usually of 3 percentage points per year in recent years. And this has been paralleled, in fact, by a similar rate of growth in the rate of participation in higher education across the globe, which is good news. It also means, though, that the share of internationally mobile students for degree studies has remained rather stable over the years, and it's on average somewhere between 2 and 2.5%. What you also see on the slide is that the top receiving regions remain Western and Eastern Europe, that together account for 37% of the flows in that year, followed by Asia and Pacific, 23%. And it is, I think, the first time actually that Asia and Pacific as a region surpasses North America as a region, top region of destination for mobile students. And then, of course, yeah, we have North America third with 22%. Western Europe is only third, though, as a country of origin for mobile students worldwide, where the main region of destination continues to be Asia and Pacific. Majority of students coming from there, respectively, 42%. All right. I'm noticing, though, that we still have a bit of a later version of my presentation, so I'll keep you here on this slide for a couple of more minutes, and actually say something also about top countries of origin and destination. So we've already seen this regional picture. At global level, in terms of country of origin of international students, China remains the first with 18.5%, but down from 19.5% the previous year. The country being also the 6th only in the top of receiving countries of international students worldwide, but climbing from the 8th place this last year. So we basically see China decreasing as a country of origin for internationally mobile students worldwide, but we see it increasing in the top of receiving countries, so increasing in attractiveness as well. In terms of countries of host countries for international students worldwide, European countries are doing quite well. So we have still 5 countries in the top 10. The top, nonetheless, continues to be headed by the United States and at a considerable distance with the other countries. The US's share in this year being 17.7%, but down from the previous year as well. When we look at the mobility flows, and again, you don't see that on the slides, but I think you'll receive the updated slides after the event with the missing charts. When we look at mobility within European higher education area, within it, top 3 countries, namely the UK, Germany, and the Russian Federation, are the top countries. The UK with mobility flows for this year slightly higher than 450,000 euros. Students in total, followed by Germany with 311,000 incoming students, and Russian Federation with just over 250,000 students studying there. Germany is also the largest center of students abroad within the European higher education area countries. German students being in this reference year as well, studying in the number of 130,000 abroad. When we look at the countries of origin within individual host countries in the European higher education area, we noticed very interesting trends as well. So, for example, in some countries like the Czech Republic, the majority of incoming students is actually trying to move the slides now because I've seen they've been updated, but unfortunately it doesn't work. So looking at the composition of incoming students per host country, we see that on the next slide that whereas in countries like Czech Republic, for example, that you see at the top of the graph on the left, has as many as 87% of incoming students from other European higher education area countries. In countries like Portugal, which is at the very bottom, only 80% of these students coming from this this educational region. The majority of students coming from outside European higher education area countries. Voila. And for Germany, perhaps, as we are hosted today at an event by the German Rectors Conference, where the majority of international students come from outside the European higher education area, and that is 62%. The large, only about 84% of students study in the European higher education area from Germany. Voila. So that was a very rushed picture on the trends as we've seen them before the COVID-19 pandemic started. So steady growth, as I mentioned already, in degree mobile students worldwide. If we look though at credit mobility, at the credit mobility situation there, having a comparative picture is slightly more difficult because we do not have the same type of internationally comparable data collection as we do for degree mobility. Nonetheless, one of the established sources of information is the Eurostudent survey, which is carried out regularly every 3 years on average, and taking stock inter alia also about the share of students that have temporary study abroad experience. as a part of their study. So not a census type of data collection, but nonetheless an important reference point. And looking back at the previous edition of Eurostudent, just to give you again a comparative perspective of how participation in credit mobility has changed over time. In 2018, for example, at the European level, for the countries that reported to the Eurostudent project, about 20% of students had a study abroad related experience. That is, we were more or less around the 20% mobility benchmark that was set up quite a number of years ago, both at the European Union level and within the European higher education area. And you also clearly see, I think, in the draft, on the graph, that quite a number of countries surpassed already at that time this 20% benchmark. I think it's worth to be said, though, that this data source also covers study and internship periods abroad, but also other types of study abroad experiences of shorter types quite often as well. So summer schools, winter school, language courses, and so on. And you actually see that in the majority of countries, this type of experience abroad is the predominant one. So that was a picture in 2018, and in the next slide, you should be able to see also the picture in 2021. So that is from the most recent version of the Eurostudent survey, where I would say we don't see very large developments. So with the average, we're still almost at the 20%. Participation rate in mobility opportunities abroad. At the same time, I want to emphasize that as for some of the countries that reported for this specific year, the survey-related data was already collected during the COVID-19 pandemic. The numbers are not fully comparable with the previous years. Nonetheless, I think it still gives us a broad brush picture on trends in participation and level in participation in credit mobility opportunities. And now getting to the topic of recognition, trying to take stock also on the progress that was made before the pandemic started on recognition-related issues to both foreign qualifications and also shorter terms of mobility and learning periods abroad. This picture on the slide is again from the 2018 edition of the Eurostudent that showed, I think, very clearly that recognition-related obstacles remain amongst the most important obstacles that mobile students encountered for credit mobility opportunities. So we were around 22% with problems with recognition of credits achieved abroad. So almost 1 in 4 mobile students reported having encountered challenges related to recognition, and slightly more than that reported also problems related to the difficulty of integrating the periods abroad into the study program at home, which we know from a separate research that also creates quite often recognition-related problems or leads to delays in studies overall. And now moving to the most recent data as well, again from the Eurostudent survey, and on the next slide. So the picture given to us in 2021 shows, I think, unfortunately, not great progress. So although recognition-related issues receive great attention at policy level, and we have quite a number of very sturdy commitments, when it comes to what the mobile students actually report, we see more or less the same number of students, so about 1 in 4 mobile students reporting still recognition-related challenges and challenges related to the integration of mobility opportunities into the curriculum, and that again, despite increased commitment also at policy level. So from 2018, for example, we have a council recommendation within the European Union framework on promoting automatic mutual recognition of foreign qualifications as well as of periods of learning abroad. So that is the picture before the pandemic, and on the next slide, you can see also a listing of some attempts that were made to solve recognition-related challenges and issues over time. We've been engaging with this concept and practice, I think, of mobility windows in many countries and institutions for some years. And just in short, a mobility window is defined as a period of time reserved for international student mobility that is embedded into the curriculum of study programs. It's a concept that has been expanding over the years, and some countries like Hungary have a long term already tradition of making the establishment of mobility windows into the curriculum a requirement for new study programs. Nonetheless, this practice that it's supposed to ease with recognition actually help the implementation of automatic recognition hasn't yet been expanded, I would say, in the majority of institutions. The concept obviously has been dealt with also in the framework of the establishment of joint study programs, where we have a European approach as well for quality assurance. And we've seen further progress, although I think not as much as we wish to have had by now, on this objective of automatic recognition. What was also emerging at the time that the pandemic started were some related policy objectives that have a potential impact on, well, student mobility overall, but also on recognition-related issues. And the first is this objective of having more inclusive mobility in the future, which would mean if we are successful with this goal, we will have more students that are internationally mobile, both for degree but also for credit mobility, and that automatically means more efforts needed for the related recognition processes. And we've also have the digitalization-related objectives on mobility that lead to a diversification of mobility formats, the stronger emergence, I would say, of blended mobility, as well as the emergence of fully online types of international learning activities more prominently. None of these formats in themselves are new, I would say, but they're started to become more mainstreamed, I would say, before the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, moving to the second part of the presentation and quickly outlining some key thoughts there as well. On this specific part, I have deliberately abstained actually of giving you related statistics and numbers, because as you certainly know, keeping stock of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on student mobility flows has been quite an adventure for the organizations that dared to venture into this task. So while we've had quite a number of snapshot pictures that were provided on different types of mobility and from different countries, we're still missing this comparative picture at the global level for sure, because of this delay in the reporting of comparable data at the global level, and also because yes, this is an ongoing, unfortunately, phenomenon. Broadly speaking, though, I think we can say that we've seen a temporary decrease in credit mobility flows. In some countries, I think Germany included, this was smaller than foreseen. So I think the drop noticed until the start of this academic year was only 30%. Which is, I think, much more positive than what was expected. We've seen, though, at the same time, when it comes to the number of applications from degree-seeking students, higher number than expecting, at least for the top receiving countries. And I will name here again Germany, but also Sweden. Throughout the pandemic period, obviously, we've had a lot of experimentation and more flexibility, I would say, in adjustments on the formats of mobilities as an emergency response to deal with the pandemic-related consequences. And then again, we've had an emergence, a bigger emergence of these previous policy objectives related to inclusion, related to digitalization, and also to the greening of mobility, or finding more sustainable means of transportation for mobile students. When it comes to the recognition aspects, though, I would dare to make a wild claim, and that is that I don't think we've made significant progress at system level with tackling the recognition-related challenges, probably understandably so, as the majority of higher education institutions focused on dealing with the immediate challenges and consequences of the pandemic on their activities. When it comes to expectations for the future, so coming towards the end of my presentation as well, very quickly, we've seen, I think, overall an interest in physical mobility that is largely reconfirmed, both in terms of degree and in credit mobility, although different scenarios have been launched by different scholars on what we might be seeing as mobility developments post-pandemic. And I think that is good news because the initial, I think, fears were that students might be hesitant for some time to travel again for study-related purposes. There are obviously always exceptions to these rules, and we know that the pandemic continues. We see additional restrictions impacting on these flows emerging also in this period. But overall, so far, I think the interest has been higher than feared. At the same time, at least funding organizations of mobility report a lower than expected interest in virtual exchanges. So over the pandemic, many students that could not be physically mobile because of travel-related and health-related restrictions were offered the possibility to study abroad from home, in a sense, through virtual exchanges. The take-up rate of those opportunities was lower than foreseen, as it seems the majority of students preferring to defer their studies, their study abroad periods, until physical mobility was possible again. I mentioned already the objective of more inclusive mobility. But if indeed we are, I think, successful with this widening participation, it means that the urgency to deal with remaining recognition challenges becomes even higher, because by default we will have a bigger pool of students participating in these mobility opportunities, and also vulnerable students for which the full recognition of their qualifications earned abroad, but also of their learning mobility periods abroad, is even more sensitive, I would say, and potentially more damaging or impactful. We continue to see a diversification of formats, and with these new formats appearing from the blended mobility to virtual exchanges, and the fully collaborative online international learning opportunities, there is a related need, of course, to address the recognition-related procedures for these new formats that start already to be widely implemented. We have some hope, I would say, from the European Universities Alliances in particular, that have been presented by the European Commission as test beds of many of these innovative ideas and formats related to mobility and also recognition. They were meant to do that even before the pandemic started, but I think the pressure on them to provide us with some interesting and innovative models has increased because of the pandemic. So hopefully some new and smoother ways to deal with recognition and also to embed these new mobility formats would come. And then, of course, related to this, also this immense work that is now going on and advancements on micro-credentials at European level, that it's supposed to flexibilize learning on the one hand, and also hopefully to ease recognition second. When it comes to the broad-brushed vision and wrapping up on the presentation, I think what I maybe personally wish to see as these different types of or mobility formats are being diversified at the moment is the development of a comprehensive mobility portfolio at institutional and at national level. And by that I mean a very strategic and willful combination of these different types of mobility, from the purely physical forms that I think can be further mainstream supported and also made more strategic, to the blended mobility formats and the incorporation of models that entail only digital or virtual components. And I very much hope that higher education institutions and also funding organizations that I represent in part, and policymakers, European and national level, would move to a truly learning outcomes oriented approach in which the choice over different formats is guided by these wider considerations and not so much by the type itself. I think, and I hope that we'll see through this inclusion agenda as well, generalization of mobility windows, or what is more and more referenced as windows of opportunities. So as more deliberate approach of integrating in one form or another these windows of international learning into the curricula, some of which will be indeed fostered through physical mobility as they did before, some of which will be fostered through blended formats, and others to purely virtual forms. Obviously, there is a dire need for progress on the automatic recognition related commitments. The policy priorities is there, and we've seen an expansion, for example, through the Benelux countries and the Baltic countries joining forces and creating this area of recognition. Obviously, we need that to expand. And last but not least, I think as we advance with the multiplication of formats and addressing the recognition-related challenges, we're going to have to also reconcile the partly conflicting policy objectives that we've listed as ACA as well quite a bit through related policy papers, and making sure that we can deliver a truly inclusive, digitally enhanced, but also sustainable mobility formats next. And with that, I've reached the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd be very glad to take up any questions or comments that might have arisen in the meantime.
Thank you so much indeed, Irina, for this very interesting keynote on student mobility. We have a couple of minutes left, and I do want to pick up and pose a question that has come up here in the chat. You spoke about the numbers, obviously, during the pandemic. And the question here is, do you expect the numbers to be back at the levels they were before the pandemic at some point?
Yes, I'll try to provide a simple answer, and the answer is that yes, I do expect they will be back at the level of the pandemic, certainly for European countries, because here, although there are some country-related differences, overall we've had a more comprehensive and consolidated response with dealing with pandemic-related challenges. So I do expect that the numbers will rebound again. I even expect increases. To be honest, in these numbers, if these sort of preliminary observations we've seen will continue. What we hear from funding organizations, for example, and we've seen that also at the level of applications for degree studies, for example, that we've actually exceeded the number of applications prior to the pandemic. So the interest is there. In degree studies for sure, and I would say also in credit mobility, where at the European level we have this very ambitious inclusion-related objective, and that means through funding programs, also like the Erasmus Plus program, there is now some dedicated funding to actually support this increase in participation. What I expect also to see, as I said already, this multiplication of types of mobility, so that for me also means that our data collection processes will have to be adjusted accordingly, so that in the future, in fact, when we speak about mobilities, we're going to speak about more diversified formats than we do at present through these statistics, where we primarily look at, where we exclusively actually look at physical mobilities, either degree or credit mobility.
All right. Last question that we have time for. There's a question here from one of our participants. What role will virtual or hybrid mobility play?
I think an important role. I might have a slight disagreement with the term of virtual mobility as such. It's a hotly debated term still, I think, within the mobility community. I would rather call them virtual exchanges, and hopefully transitioning to this very integrated type of virtual exchanges, which we refer to as COIL, so Collaborative Online International Learning. I expect them to play a very, very important role. And I'll just share an experience and the reason for which I'm here now in Czech Republic. I'm visiting one of the universities participating in the European Universities Alliances and implementing these different mobility formats. We see in such visits a high increase in these virtual exchange formats and high interest from the academics. I'm not saying that these will surpass or take over in terms of interest compared to physical mobilities, but I do expect they will play a significant role. And we also start to see evidence of how they could truly serve as appetizers for physical mobility later on of longer duration. So they seem to be a great way of sensitizing, particularly students that might not otherwise consider longer term study abroad opportunities. So I think we're there.
And we're almost there indeed, as far as the keynote is concerned. Last question, 60 seconds answer. Hubert Ertel is asking, what needs to be done to make virtual mobility more attractive? Or in your words, what needs to be done to make virtual exchanges more attractive?
Yes, I think we, first of all, have to stop promoting them as mobility, because they're not. So I think we have to adjust with that, a bit more provocatively, but we have to adjust the way we promote these opportunities. So we have to be, rather than promoting the form as such, virtual exchanges, promote what these exchanges actually bring to students in terms of learning outcomes and experience, and how they could be helpful. I think that's a discussion we're having overall about mobility in general, that we should shift a bit the focus from the promotion of mobility as such to the promotion of what mobility brings to students and institutions. As part of this adaptation of key messages processes, if we look at it from an inclusion-related lens, we have to make sure these messages about these new types of mobility in particular are articulated in a way that resonates with our target audiences as well. That's it. I'm not sure it was 60 seconds, but...
We got all we need. Irina Ferencz, thank you so much for this very insightful, very interesting keynote on student mobility. I'm sure our participants learned a lot and took a lot from that with them. Thank you so much, Irina. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much as well.